Hey guys, Will here. So today we're going to be taking a look at Next Level Racing's new FGT Elite 160, which is the best of the best when it comes to quality from Next Level Racing. There's a couple of things that we're going to be checking out in today's video. Obviously going to be looking at the normal things like adjustability, adaptability, expandability, rigidity, all those important things. One particular thing that we're going to be evaluating in today's video though is the adjustability between a Formula style, as you see in front of me now, and a GT style seating position. This particular cockpit allows you to adjust between the two and anything you want in between with no additional parts required. So we're going to check out just how easy it is to make those adjustments in today's video too. And by the end of this process, you should have a good idea of whether this is going to be the sim racing cockpit for you. So let's dive in. So let's quickly kick off by thanking the sponsor of today's video, Micro Center. Now, if you're in the US, you're probably already familiar with Micro Center as a really fantastic resource when it comes to all things electronic and computer gear. What you might not know is that they also sell an expanding range of sim racing gear. Now, this is really exciting for us sim racers because it means you actually have the opportunity to get eyes on, and in some cases even hands-on, with an increasing variety of sim racing products before you choose to buy them. So you'll find links down in the description below for all of these details, but they've got a new customer exclusive offer running at the moment where you get $25 off your purchase of $100 or more. And they've also just implemented a brand new sim racing rig builder on their website too, so that is definitely worth checking out. They've got a brand new store opening in Charlotte in early 2023, so you can check them out via the links down in the description below or visit your local Micro Center today. So we also need to say a quick thank you as well to, of course, Next Level Racing for supplying today's cockpit for us to check out. Now, they have also supplied us over the years with a range of their other cockpits too, which we will be making a few comparisons to in today's video. We've also tested out a bunch of other cockpits from other manufacturers over the years as well. So it's important that you know that everything we're talking about today has all been sent to us under the same conditions, other than my SimLab P1X cockpit, which I did actually purchase for myself a number of years ago now. Now, one thing I do want to mention here as well, some of our reviews of these other cockpits are starting to get a little bit old now, particularly when it comes to track racers. They've had a couple of revisions of their products since then. So I would definitely encourage you to check out some other people's reviews of those products as well, just to get yourself as much knowledge so you're making the best decision possible. But a big thank you to Next Level Racing for making this possible by sending across the gear that we're going to be looking at in today's video. As is always the case here at Boosted Media, they don't get any sort of influence over what I'm saying. It's purely just my own opinions and my own observations that I'm going to be sharing with you today. But yeah, just wanted to get all that out of the way first so you know exactly the context of what we're doing in today's review video. So this is the FGT Elite 160. As I said, it sits at the very top of the Next Level Racing line of sim racing cockpits. So let's talk a little bit about pricing first of all. Now, I'm not going to dive super deep into this one today simply because shipping and taxes on these things makes a massive difference to the price you'll pay depending on where you are in the world. So I would definitely encourage you to do your own research here, have a look at some of the competitor products that we've reviewed and others have reviewed too, to figure out what's going to represent the best value for money where you live. But to give you the rundown quickly on this particular cockpit, you're looking at $1,149 US for the wheel plate edition, as we see here. There is also a side mount edition available. We'll talk about that a little bit later on in some more detail. That comes in at $1,299 US. There's also a Ferrari licensed version of this available too, which is also $1,299 for the wheel deck version. Then if you're in Europe, you're looking at €1,299 for the wheel plate base edition, or $1,499 for the Ferrari or the side mount edition. If you're in Australia, you're looking at $1,499 for the wheel plate edition and $1,600 for the side mount and Ferrari edition. So immediately there you can see the difference between the Australian pricing and what you're paying overseas is quite different from what you'd see from a lot of other manufacturers. Typically our exchange rate here is pretty mean to us. So this does represent a pretty good competitive deal if you're in Australia, but maybe not quite so much so if you're elsewhere in the world. But again, just do your own research to make sure you're getting the best deal. So what I want to do now is jump into the experience of actually building one of these things. Their documentation and their resources for doing this are very, very detailed. So there's no need to actually run you through the entire build process like some sort of instructional guide. But let's dive in now. I'll show you what that experience was like. But first of all, starting with what you're going to have to do when you get this thing delivered to your house. Now, the box is 67 kilograms or 147 pounds. So I like the fact that they put everything in the one box because it means that there's far less likelihood of things going missing shipping. That's one of the problems that we've had with some other brands in the past. So that side of it I appreciate. The packaging is all very nice as well. It's all nicely presented and you know, easy to unpackage and you know, kind of know where everything is and it's not too messy. But disadvantage is it's extremely heavy. So if you're trying to drag it upstairs or you know, something like that, you're not going to be moving the box around on your own. It actually arrived here on a wooden pallet, believe it or not. And yeah, it wasn't too difficult between the two of us, of course, but if you're on your own, you may have a little bit of difficulty. So just keep that in mind. The only complaint that I had with regards to packaging was just the fact that the polystyrene foam that they pack everything in was just crumbling all over the place. Quite a lot of it was already broken up when we opened the box. And so that meant that there's a lot of little bits of polystyrene foam kind of all over the profile. It sticks to it as well because it builds up quite a bit of static electricity. You know, not a big deal. Again, just something to be aware of. It would have been nice if they'd individually wrapped the pieces of profile with some paper maybe. We see that with some other manufacturers, just so that when you unwrap the profile, it's all nice and clean and ready to go. That said though, there was no issues with residual metal shavings or anything like that. That's another issue that we've run into with some other manufacturers in the past too. So no issues with regards to that whatsoever. They obviously put a lot of effort into the finishing of the products to make sure they come out of the factory nice and clean. So look, in terms of assembly, it was the typical experience that we've come to expect from Next Level Racing. I'm not going to run you through the entire installation process as a manual because they have their own extremely high quality manual that runs you through all the necessary steps in a lot of detail. They also have a full assembly guide in video form on their YouTube channel as well, which is very detailed. We didn't need that at all. We just ran through the instructions here. And the thing that I really appreciated about the presentation of this manual is that it gives you both a visual and a written representation of what to do. And it gives you all the parts that you're going to need, including all the nuts and bolts for each step as well. So if you're a visual learner or a written learner, regardless, everything's covered here. I basically just followed the pictures and had absolutely no issues at all putting this thing together. It was actually a joy to put together after some of the experiences we've had in the past with some profile rigs. So there are a couple of tips and tricks that I recommend when you are putting together a profile rig, just to make sure that everything lines up nicely. One of the things that I always use is a little set square like this guy, adjustable set square that allows you to just measure distances and make sure that everything is adjusted symmetrically between the two sides of the rig so that everything lines up properly. You'll find that spending a little bit more time getting measurements right in the initial phase saves a lot of messing around later on trying to get things to line up and mounted properly and adjusted properly. So I actually have a separate video on the channel where I went through all of my tips for building an aluminium profile rig. I'll link it down in the description below for you guys to check out. I'll also put an Amazon link to these guys on the description box as well. But look, the honest truth is I didn't end up actually needing to use this for the initial build of this rig at least anyway, because if you come in a little bit closer, you'll see it's actually got little markings pretty much in all the places that you need them to make fine-tuning adjustments and make sure that everything's symmetrical. The only place that I would have liked to, or two places that I would have liked to have had them and didn't, was just where the pedal arms mount down here. You can see there's actually a little bit of a misalignment there because I haven't gone through and measured them yet. And also just for the tops of the seat rails too, it would have been nice to have the same markings there. But I mean, that's a pretty arbitrary thing. You're going to be adjusting it anyway. Where it's really critical is for your upright adjustments here to make sure that both sides of the pedal plate are even. Forward and back are here as well, so you're not ending up askew. And then of course the height of the wheel deck as well. So there are markings in all of those positions. And yeah, that's gonna make it a lot easier just to see as a quick reference when you're adjusting things that you've got everything level. They do also include inside the kit as well a little spirit level, which we did use quite extensively to make sure that everything was nice and level. You can see that is pretty much bang on. Crossways, if we go front to back, it's gonna be off, but that's an adjustment for the wheel deck, which we'll adjust later on. Anyway, so yeah, look, in terms of installation, absolute breeze, no issues whatsoever to speak of. And as I said, an absolute joy to put together, to be honest with you guys. So no complaints there whatsoever. And they've obviously put a lot of effort into their documentation to make sure that people have a really good experience front to end, which is again, what we've come to expect from Next Level Racing. The experience has been that way for a very long time now, at least a good 3 or 4 years that we've been testing their gear. So I think the main difference between something like this with the installation process compared to something like say your GT Track or your FGT, if you've ever built one of those, is you can have a little bit of trouble getting holes to line up and you're kind of having to stretch metal and bend things to get things to line up. With something like this, you just don't have those issues. Now, they also include all the tools that you're gonna need to put this together as well. You can actually see there's a nice little mount here, which they include, and they do include this on the FGT Elite non-160 version as well. So they give you a little ratchet here with a forward and reverse direction, a couple of little Allen heads for that ratchet, and then a couple of Allen keys. There are also a couple of little mini spanners in there as well. Honestly, I did end up just using my own tools just to make it a little bit easier, but what they include in the package is perfectly adequate for getting the job done. And that little ratchet I actually use for a lot of other stuff around the studio as well. I've got a couple of them now from some of the other rigs that they've sent us over the years. One of the main things that I think you may end up having issues with is the fact that this wheel deck is on a slight angle here. So that can mean that certain hardware that you might purchase from third-party manufacturers to use in conjunction with this rig might be a little bit more difficult to mount than it would be if you had direct uprights for your wheel deck. It also has the, not necessarily disadvantage, but the difference of the wheel deck moving further away from you as you move it up and down. So that is one thing to consider as well. Look, for me personally, I prefer just to have straight uprights here, but one of the advantages of this design is it does make getting in and out of the rig a little bit more easy because you've got a little bit more clearance for your feet and your legs as you're climbing in and out. You can imagine if the wheel deck was upright here, it's just a little bit more closed in than it is with this design. So it's a take or leave thing. I think it looks a little bit more visually interesting as well, and it doesn't appear to have any impact on the rigidity of these rigs whatsoever. We'll talk about that more when we get up and driving a little bit later on, but you can see really thick, chunky steel mounts for those uprights. That's actually, I think, 5mm thick steel. It's 7mm in total, but it's accounting for the powder coat. It's probably 5 or 6mm thick steel, but more than adequate, I believe, to be rigid enough. But again, we'll see that when we go for a drive a little later on. And yeah, just everywhere you look, really nice, high quality hardware, as you would expect for the price. I do also like the design of this pedal deck as well. I was in a little bit of two minds about it initially when we first tested it with the FGT Elite. But what I like about it is the fact it does give the ability to bolt in or put nuts on the underside. Whereas if you're bolting directly into profile, you can't get in from underneath, which does make it this a little bit more easy to work with than some other cockpits are, again, depending on how rigid it is. So that's definitely something that we'll be paying attention to a little bit later on. Now you'll also notice up the front here as well, we do have these adjustments for the height and angle of our pedal tray too. So this is an FGT, meaning that it can be adjusted between Formula and GT seating positions. So that's another thing that we were looking at in today's video too. But basically the way this works is you just unscrew the bolts on either side, and you can see those are nice high quality bolts with a nice metal head on them. And that little notch there goes into the groove on this side, and that locks it nicely into place. And it is quite a lot sturdier than what you get on the FGT Elite non-160 version. So that's just having a little bit of trouble getting that in. There we go, that's better. All good. So just quickly come over to the FGT Elite non-160 version. And we've stripped this one down a little bit. We're using a few parts on it elsewhere, but you can see just the difference in the thickness of the materials. The profile is a lot thinner here as well. We're looking at 40mm by 40mm rather than 40 by 80mm for our pedal deck. And look, we didn't have any major issues with flex on this rig. I felt that it was perfectly sturdy enough for the majority of users, but you can definitely see the differences between what we have here and what we have with the likes of the 160s. And then with the non-160 version, you can see we also do just have standard M8 bolts here. You can see they're a little bit rusty from being in storage. That's not Next Level Racing's fault. That's my fault for having this in a damp storage area for too long. But you know, compare that to what we have here, and just the quality of the hardware is a lot nicer and easier to work with, and toolless as well in this case on the 160 version. So quite a few steps up in quality overall. Now, the other thing to mention just quickly here as well, this is the wheel deck version. So we've got a nice solid wheel deck up here with various different mounting patterns. All the various compatibility information is available on their website, so I'm not going to run all through that now. Now, there is a front and side mount version available too. Unfortunately, they didn't send that to us, but it works pretty much the same way as what we have for the FGT Elite. Just obviously the back part here is going to be accounting for the 40 by 120 profile that we have here rather than 40 by 80. So it's going to be a little bit thicker overall, but we never had any issues with the front and side mount on the FGT Elite, so I wouldn't imagine that it's going to be an issue here either. Very nice and clean design, and if you want to see more information on how this works, check out a review of the FGT Elite linked down in the description below. So then in terms of the seat mounting as well, nice thick sturdy seat rails. Again here, we haven't mounted a seat up on it yet. We will be mounting our ES1 seat on it a little bit later on when we go for a drive. But again, just as we saw with the FGT Elite, we've got these little ratchet M8 bolts here which allow us to loosen off like so. And then there's actually some little felt pads underneath here as well, which allow you to glide the seat forward and back on here once you've loosened these off and not damage and scratch up your beautiful anodized black profile. So that's a nice little touch as well. Just lots of little inclusions like that you get with this higher end next level racing stuff that we haven't seen from other manufacturers, at least with the gear that we've had here in the studio to test. Same deal with the wheel deck as well. There's some little stick-on pads on either side of that too that allow it to glide up and down a little bit more easily without binding and scratching up paint and things like that. So yeah, look, the attention to detail in the design of this is absolutely fantastic. That's one thing that I've complained about with some of their more entry-level stuff. We had a look at one of their folding cockpits just a couple of months ago here at Boosted Media, and there are a couple of aspects of the design with that I just thought, even though it's a cheaper product, you know, it could have been better for the price. Whereas something like this, you know, there's not really anything on here, at least at face value, that I think, you know, why did they do that? Everything just kind of makes sense. Everything's very well built. Everything's very well thought out. And overall, just a really impressive product so far. Now, there's a couple more things that I just want to quickly touch on here with regards to the aluminium profile that they're using. So I've grabbed a piece of profile from a Track Racer TR160 and a SimLab P1X cockpit. Now, this is a relatively old Track Racer cockpit that we had now. We reviewed it probably 3 years ago on the channel, so I'm not 100% certain whether they're still using the exact same profile. And again, with the P1X cockpit, this was about 3 years ago that we reviewed this as well. So just check and make absolutely sure that what I'm saying here is accurate. But the point I'm trying to make here is that there are differences between different types of profiles. So I'm just gonna pop one of these caps off here so we can have a little look at what we're working with. And what you'll notice here is that the internal structure of the profile itself is quite thin if you compare it to what we have here with the SimLab. So I'll hold it like that, and you can see for yourselves that this is just a lot thicker in general, more similar to what we have with the Track Racer profile here. So look, to be honest with you guys, I've never actually found that to make any difference whatsoever for the purpose of sim racing. We've had the Track Racer with the thinner profile rig. We've got their TR120 we've tested with a variety of different motion platforms running absolutely insane motion levels, and we've never had any discernible flex or anything that we even spotted on camera in terms of the frame itself flexing. And even with the TR120 that has that step in the middle of it where you're bolting things together, even then we didn't see any excessive flex or anything like that. So look, I don't think that this is necessarily an advantage or a reason to go with something like a P1X over something like this, but it is a little subtle difference in the profile type. So I thought it was important to just point out to you guys so you're aware. But yeah, I wouldn't base my purchasing decision on this alone because I don't think that it's going to have an impact overall. This profile is perfectly sturdy enough, as we saw when we tested the FGT Elite, but later on you'll see when we go for a drive anyway. But one other thing that is vitally important when it comes to the type of profile being used is the compatibility with various different types of T-nuts, which are essential for mounting accessories and bits and pieces to your rig. So let's move this stuff aside quickly here, and we'll chuck this up here so I can show you exactly what I'm talking about. So these are the T-nuts that they include with this particular rig. Now, there were only about 3 of these left over inside our package. That is one little nitpick that I do have. They were very good about including all the bits and pieces that you need and labeling everything clearly as well, but I would like to see them include an assortment of T-nuts with various different thread sizes as well. They do include only M8, which is what's compatible with the bolts that they use for building the rig itself. But a lot of accessories use M6 or sometimes even M4 bolts. So having an assortment of those included as well would be a nice touch. But this particular type of T-nut, you can see it's really thick. And what that does is it makes it nice and sturdy in terms of how it sits inside the channel. So there's not a lot of movement or rocking around or anything like that. The disadvantage of this type of T-nut is that you do have to slot it in from the end of a piece of profile. You can't just kind of push it through the gap like that and then roll it into place like what you can with these other types of T-nuts that we'll talk about in just a moment. Now that, you might be wondering what's the problem with that? What it means is if you want to mount an accessory, say, between here and here, you can't actually get a T-nut in there without taking these parts off, slide it past, because obviously if you're sliding in from the end, you've got all these other T-nuts that are blocking it. So that can be very frustrating. And the reason why I call that out with this particular type of profile is you can see if you come back over here, the channels themselves are quite thick. They are compatible with these T-nuts, but if you try to use one of these rollable type T-nuts that are a little bit thinner, that is actually just going to drop straight down inside and not be useful at all. So this type of profile, unfortunately, isn't going to be compatible with a lot of the T-nuts that you get with accessories that you might purchase for the rig from other manufacturers. So just be aware of that. That can be a little bit of a problem. If your accessories come with the leaf spring style of T-nut, like what you see here, this is a similar idea. The little leaf spring provides the tension inside the profile channel to stop it from sliding back and forth freely, but also still allows us to tuck it in from the side. A little bit more difficult to work with than the rollerball type. These do work in this type of profile. So at least the ones I have do. You can see they do slot in and lock into place quite nicely and hold their position. So if your accessories come with this type, you should be okay. But if they come with the rollerball shallow type, which is more common, at least in my experience, with most of the accessories that we've seen coming through the studio, you will have a few problems there. So in my opinion, it would be good for them to include not only a bunch of extra M8 ones in case you want to mount extra accessories, but also some M6 and M4 leaf spring style T-nuts that are going to allow you to mount those accessories if you need to, so you're not having to chase around and try and find T-nuts that are going to fit when you've just bought a nice shiny new accessory for your rig. But look, I think that covers everything we need to in terms of just initial impressions and initial run over the rig. Let's get the hardware mounted on here now. We're going to roll with an Acertec wheelbase and their Forte pedals. I think they're nice stiff pedals that are going to give us a good opportunity to test flex in the rig. We'll also get the ES1 seat mounted up on the rig as well. We're not going to go into a lot of detail on the ES1 seat today because we have covered that previously. I'll link that video down in the description below. But suffice to say that we've been really impressed with this seat. You would have seen it in a bunch of our test videos over the years. Nice and wide, so if you're a bigger person, that's not going to be an issue, but it still has quite a lot of comfort and support in there as well. So you do feel quite secured in the seat. You're not going to be sliding around all over the place, but very comfortable overall. So no issues at all recommending this guy. No flex in the back or anything like that either. But we'll get that mounted up, get all the other hardware on here, get all the cable management sorted out as well, give you a quick tour of what it looks like when everything is populated, and then we'll get into what it's like to drive with. Okay, so hardware is all mounted up now. We ended up having to put the DD2 on the wheel deck simply because I mistakenly thought that the holes that were pre-drilled in the wheel deck would be compatible with the Acertec La Prima, Forte and Invicta bases, but unfortunately they weren't. So I wanted to, there are solutions that you can use to mount that to this, but I wanted to have a base that was directly hard mounted directly to the plate, so there wasn't any extra flex or anything like that introduced, because we want to put this to the test in the most authentic way we possibly can. We put the Forte pedals on, as I explained before, and then we mounted our Fanatic shifter and our Mozza handbrake here, just to give us a little bit more variance in mounting. So look, no issues to speak of whatsoever with mounting things. In particular, as I was mentioning before, it is a lot more versatile having the pedals being able to be mounted this way, because you can get bolts in from underneath. So if you are working with pedals that need you to be able to get in from the underside, that's a lot more possible here. Because these particular pedals have an integrated heel plate as well, that's not an issue. Most pedals on the market these days do have some sort of base plate or heel plate that you can buy separately, but you don't have an integrated heel plate with this particular rig like you see on some other sim racing rigs. You can see it, we've also added the included cable management clips here as well. So they've got these nice little plastic clips that have 4 little slots in them, which you can tuck your cables through and manage them around the rig. There's a whole bag full of those. We only ended up using 2 of them, but there are more included in the kit if you need them. And yeah, look, honestly, no issues at all with getting things mounted up. The only drama we really had was just when we started trying to get things adjusted and in exactly the right position. There are a couple of limitations there, which we'll get into in just a moment. But first I wanted to jump into the cockpit here and just show you how things flex and how things move or don't move and flex. Now, remembering that when we reviewed the FGT Elite, we were pretty impressed overall. I felt like it was rigid enough, but this does take things a step further again. So we'll start with the wheel deck here. We've got the Fanatic DD2, as I mentioned before, with the Porsche GT3R wheel. And you can see as I pull that wheel up and down, there's a little bit of flex inherent in the quick release itself. But if you just pay attention to the base, you can see, or at least with my eyes, I can see there's a little bit of wiggle there if I really get into it as hard as I reasonably can. But I mean, under normal driving conditions, as you'll see in the driving footage, absolutely no issue, no perceivable flex there whatsoever, as of course we would expect at this kind of price point. Same kind of deal with the FGT Elite, to be honest with you guys. So I wouldn't really say that this is a significant step up in terms of what you perceive as the driver. Then we move on to the shifter and the handbrake. So in this case, I am actually quite impressed with this compared to the other rigs that we've seen from Next Level Racing. These plates do give us quite a bit of versatility in terms of what we can mount. You can see here we've got the Mozza handbrake mounted alongside the Fanatic shifter. There's always been a little bit of flex and wobble inherent in the design of these, but this one is quite a bit more sturdy than what we've seen in the past. You can see just a little bit of additional reinforcement and bracing underneath here, thicker materials being used and whatnot, which does make quite a significant difference. So if I pull on that shifter and shove on it as hard as I can, I'll switch it across to H pattern mode as well. You probably see a little bit of wiggle on camera. It's not completely without any flex at all, but certainly nothing that I would say is excessive. You do feel a little bit of, I guess, reverberation through the entire rig. So when I shift it into gear, I do feel a little bit of vibration in the seat of my pants. But I mean, that's pretty typical and pretty normal of any cockpit. And I think that, yeah, overall, they've done a good job of the design here, giving the versatility of, you know, various different mounting options like what we see here, but also having something that's nice and sturdy. Same deal with the handbrake as well. You've got quite a bit of leverage here being mounted right on the outer edge. And again, there's a little bit of flex, well, quite a lot of flex in the handle of that particular handbrake itself, but I'm not really perceiving much at all to complain about here in terms of what's actually on the thing. You can actually see the shifter moving a little bit, and I am feeling a little bit of wiggle in the seat of my pants, but again, certainly nothing that I would call excessive. Now, in terms of ergonomics, just quickly here as well, while we're talking about the shifter, there are two different ways that you can mount the shifter and handbrake here. So we've got this attached to the wheel deck, as you can see. There is also a way that you can mount this alongside you down here too. So if you like to have the shifter a little bit further away from you, I actually like to have it quite close to the wheel. Ideally, I'll probably end up actually moving this back just a little bit, which means I'll have to raise this piece up just slightly to be able to slide this one back. So there is a little bit of compromise there, but I don't think anybody's going to have any major issues getting their shifter and handbrake into the right position. Remembering, of course, that different shifters have different length stems. So some people are going to want to have this a lot lower than what I have it here, and some people might actually want to have it a lot higher than what I have here. You can't really go much higher because you're limited by the scope of adjustment here. You could go probably another 2 inches, I would say, before you max that out, because that bracket can go all the way to the top here. But yeah, look, I think overall it's a good design there. As I mentioned earlier with regards to getting in and out of the rig, it does give you extra foot clearance. As you can see, I can swing my feet around and not be smacking them into the uprights all the time, which is quite nice. But we already talked about the trade-offs there with regards to the wheel moving further away from you as you move it up and down. But we were able to get this into a nice, comfortable driving position. Seat was no issue either. You can see we did end up putting this on the back of the rails. Just for reference, I'm about 6 foot tall, and we did have to max out the available travel in terms of moving the seat backwards, but that was no issue at all. So that brings us on to the pedals. Flex-wise, these are, as I said before, the Acertec Forte pedals, which are extremely stiff. Even putting in my maximum amount of possible braking pressure here, which is about 110, 120 kilograms, according to the calibration of these particular pedals anyway. I'm not perceiving any flex there whatsoever. If I look visually, I can see a little bit of a dip just in that front cross member, but certainly nothing that you would ever perceive when driving. Maybe a tiny bit more flex, admittedly, than I have on my SimLab P1X, but I'd say on par with most of the other rigs that I've tested over the years. So again, certainly nothing to complain about there whatsoever in terms of pedal rigidity. Adjustability is where things start to get a little bit complicated. Now, none of this is a complaint, so to speak, because admittedly we do have a lot more adjustability overall with this rig than what we have with most other aluminium profile cockpits. So we have to kind of put it in perspective here, but there are quite a few limitations, I guess you could say, in terms of how you can adjust things, just because what you do to one thing has a very, very big influence on how other things move, and it'll all make sense in a moment. So the way I've actually got this set up now is in a driving style that kind of suits everything. So it's somewhat of a hybrid seating position. You can see we've actually got the seat slung quite low here on the seat rails. There's actually a second set of holes lower down here on this particular seat. So even though it looks like it's mounted up quite high, we could actually raise the bottom of this seat by about 2 inches, and that would obviously make me a lot more upright. Now you'll notice if you have a look at the pedal tray here, it is actually adjusted into its maximum GT position, but because the relative position between the pedal tray and the seat is quite offset because of the low slung seat, it does mean that my feet are a little bit higher than they probably actually intend to have with this particular cockpit. But what this means is that I'm comfortable driving GT style all the way through to Formula. It means I don't have to go in and change things every single time I want to drive. Now, the reason I call that out is because with all the other cockpits that we've tested, with the exception of the Next Level Racing FGT Elite, which is obviously also intended to be adapted between Formula and GT style, we weren't able to actually get the pedal tray up this high. So you would need to have some sort of a third-party pedal tray on top of their factory options, simply because they're a lot slimmer of a unit to begin with, because they're bolting into the profile down the bottom rather than sort of hanging off the front of the wheel deck here. So the fact that I was able to get this into such a nice, comfortable, all-rounder kind of style seating position, I think is an important thing to call out. Now, later on in the video, I will take you through and show you what it looks like in its maximum GT and maximum Formula settings. You'll see when we get into that, that it's a massive difference between the two and more adjustment scope than I think anybody would need. But I'm going to jump up quickly now and just talk a little bit more about the adjustments with regards to the pedal tray. So they've designed this in such a way that everything is kind of interconnected. Now, that's not necessarily a problem. I'm certainly not complaining here. But what it does do is it somewhat limits the amount of adjustment that you can do in terms of things like pedal positioning and pedal angle, just aside from the overall, I guess, seating position and, you know, basic setup of the cockpit. So what I mean by that is, if you can imagine, if you want to move the uprights for the wheel deck, that's also going to move the pedals back as well because of the way these things are all connected. Now, you might think, well, that's fine. You just move the pedal trays forward a little bit and then, you know, that can kind of counter that adjustment. But you can see here, because these uprights have to go in between these two parts here, we've got a limited scope of adjustment. So if you come up a little bit closer and actually look down here, you can see there are some little cutouts here which basically stipulate how far forward and back you can go with this. Now, obviously the spacing between these would vary depending on the pedals that you had mounted. So then, to play out that scenario a little bit further, you know, we run out of adjustment in terms of how far further we can push the pedals away from us, because we end up hitting on the front here. So then we have to move the seat back. But then once you move the seat back, you want to move the wheel deck back. But then to move the wheel deck back, you've got to move these parts back, which then means the pedals are coming further back towards you. And you can see how it kind of just all, because it's all interconnected, it does create a bit of an issue there. Whereas a lot of other cockpits that we've tested, you know, each individual part, so the seat, the wheel deck, and the pedals are completely independent of each other. So their adjustments all work independently as well. Now, admittedly, those other cockpits don't have the scope of adjustability in terms of being able to adjust between a Formula and a GT seating position. So it really just does kind of come down to what you want. But look, I mean, it's not a problem, so to speak. It's just a limitation that I think you guys need to be aware of, particularly if you're on the taller side. As I said before, I'm 6 foot tall, and you know, we were able to get this into a good seating position ultimately, and it's not a problem once it's set up. But you know, if you are wanting to chop and change between seating positions regularly, or you've got different people driving your rig regularly, then it definitely is a little bit more complicated to work with on this than it is with some others. Look, it's just a limitation of the way that they've designed this. And I'd say that, you know, the way they've designed it opens up a lot of other opportunities. So it's just basically a game of trade-offs, I guess you could say. But anyway, I think that explains everything we need to in terms of the basic layout and design. We'll get in and do some driving now, show you what that all looks like, talk about the driving experience, and then I'll show you the difference between a completely Formula and completely GT style seating position as well. So what is the FGT Elite 160 actually like to drive with? Now, there were not really any surprises here. What we showed objectively before when we took you through all the various different areas and the flex inherent in each one. No real observations that I had from the driving experience which really told me anything other than what we've already shown you guys. So all the individual elements, from the shifter mount, the wheel deck, the seat, and the pedals, no issues with flex, nothing that was perceivable when I was driving whatsoever in any of those areas, which is again something that we always look for. And I did actually come to appreciate more, the more I got in and out, just how much difference it makes actually having this on a bit of an angle here so that you can get in and out a little bit easier, particularly in the Formula style seating position where you want that wheel to be a little bit closer to you than maybe in GT or hybrid. Getting in and out was a lot easier with it laid out in that manner. So I think really, there's not a lot more to talk about when it comes to the driving experience overall, simply because, you know, it's a solid rig, doesn't have any, you know, noticeable flex anywhere, and overall it just does a solid job at all the things that you need it to. But I do want to talk a little bit more about the different seating positions and setups with this rig, because that's where things can get a little bit complicated. Now, in their marketing, I haven't seen them say anything about, ease of transition or anything like that. They're not making out that this is something that you can quickly transition between Formula and GT style seating positions. So it's certainly not a case of false advertising or anything like that. But I do want to make it very clear to you guys what the actual real world experience is like actually changing this between Formula and GT style seating positions. Now, you'll see the majority of the driving footage, I actually had it in somewhat of a hybrid seating position. So I had the seat a little bit more reclined than you would typically find in a GT style car, and the pedals a little bit higher up as well, to give me a kind of an experience which is adaptable between Formula and GT style racing without having to go in and change the rig every single time. And that's the same way I actually have my P1X cockpit set up for my daily driver rig too. I don't actually alter anything between driving the different styles of car just because it's easier, and yeah, I just prefer it that way personally. And it is a subjective thing, that is just my own personal opinion. But what is objectively important here is the fact that it is actually quite, not necessarily difficult, but there is quite a lot involved in changing between seating positions here. So what we can see now is pretty much completely maxed out Formula style seating position. So we've got the pedals, on a very steep angle here. The wheel is actually pointing downwards slightly, and then the seat is reclined here too. So let's start off with the seat here. Now they do actually include some shoulder bolts which you can use in this groove here too, to make it even easier still to adjust. But look, there was no issues at all adjusting the seat into pretty much any position you want. It's just 4 bolts. This particular seat, the ES1, has a couple of different sets of holes too, so you can raise it up really high like you see in our GT style driving footage, and then nice and low slung like what we have here, fully reclined in the, or almost fully reclined. We actually did end up dropping it or raising it up one more notch here just to get a little bit less angle on it for my particular body shape. But plenty of adjustment here with regards to the seat, and no issues at all transitioning between different seating positions. Something that'll probably take you less than 3 minutes to just adjust that seating position. I didn't really find the need to use the shoulder bolt system here. They do include that if you want to use it, but just undoing these bolts, these M8 bolts, and just putting them back in the right position was no issue at all. Similar with the wheel deck up here as well. You just loosen, there's 4 bolts on each side, so 8 bolts in total. You do obviously just need to make sure that when you loosen it doesn't drop down and crush your feet. So it does help to have a second person just to help support the deck while you're moving it. If you don't have a second person, it is perfectly doable though. But yeah, you just undo or loosen the 4 bolts on either side and you can tilt it and move it up and down. And it does slide pretty nicely in the channels here. You can see we haven't marked the aluminium profile at all, moving it up and down and adjusting angles. It's all slid very nicely with those little sliding pads that we saw, those little felt pads that stick on either side. That does make a genuine difference there and make it nice and easy to work with. So yeah, no issues, no difficulties with the seat or the wheel deck. I should also mention on the seat quickly too, having those sliders like what we saw up here down on the seat rails to allow them to move forward and back a little bit more easily is a nice touch as well. Doesn't move very nicely when you're sitting in it, but if you jump out, loosen them off and slide it, it works quite well. But then we need to move over onto the pedal tray area, and this is where things do get quite complicated. Now, I've been thinking long and hard about the best way to convey this, because it's not a complaint about the product. I don't really see any way that they could make this any easier, but it's just an inherent complexity in the design. So again, it's about managing expectation here, I suppose, rather than, negatively reviewing the product. But what I want you guys to know is that it is quite difficult here to switch the pedals between different positions. So as I showed you earlier on in the video, everything is kind of tied together here, and what you do to one part of the rig influences what you have to do in another area, and it does get quite complex quite quickly. So the well, let's just start by saying that to switch it between the fully GT style across to the Formula seating position, the first time we did it took me about 35 minutes, and that was with Tom's help as well. I wasn't super confident doing this on my own, simply because there is quite a bit of weight in this. As you saw earlier, these pedal plates here are made of steel, so they are very heavy. And I was just worried that if any one thing slipped, you kind of can't hold everything all at once. And if any one thing slipped unexpectedly, it could land on my wrist or my finger or something like that and cause a pretty nasty injury. So look, it is definitely possible to make adjustments on your own, but I would go as far as to say that it's maybe a little bit dangerous to try and do it on your own, particularly if you have a pedal set mounted. So again, I'm not trying to say that it's an inherently dangerous or bad product, just managing expectation here so you know what you're going to be in for if you're trying to switch between the 2 seating positions. So let's just drill into this a little bit more. You have to adjust the position of these 2 sides here, which involves undoing these 2 bolts. You then also need this arm to be able to slide freely as well, which means you have to undo the bolts down here. We're going to come back to those in just a minute because you'll see how the aluminium profile's already gotten quite marked from adjusting this. Then you also need to undo the shoulder bolts, which you see in here too. Now those do have little Allen key slots on them to make them a little bit easier. And then you will also probably find that you need to slide your pedals forward and back too, just to be able to get this into the right position, because what happens is you bump into it on either side up in these parts here, as you kind of briefly saw before when we were looking at the GT or the hybrid style seating position. So you end up loosening two there, 4 here, and the shoulder bolt here on both sides. And that means that everything is kind of just moving around, not completely freely, because the T-nuts themselves do bind up a little bit, but you have to put in quite a bit of effort to kind of get things to move into the right position. And you'll find that, as I was saying before, because one thing is kind of influenced by another, to get this high enough, then this kind of gets in the way, and then you have to move the pedals because this gets in the way of this and blocks this part, and it just becomes not necessarily a mess, but it becomes quite complex to get things into the right position. So again, I would recommend, once you've figured out the seating positions that you want, definitely mark them, and then you'll get a sense when you've done it a couple of times of, you know, what needs to be loosened, where to pull on various different parts to make it do the things that you want it to do. The point I'm trying to make here is that this isn't something that you're going to be quickly changing between different types of cars. So like if you're in iRacing and you decide you want to quickly jump in a Formula style race, you're not going to be jumping up, making the adjustments on the rig and then jumping back in and, you know, changing it back to GT afterwards. It's just not a practical thing to do. Now that brings me back to what we were looking at down here with the profile. So because of the amount of weight that is resting on these two bolts, there's not really any clean way to slide this back and forth. You can imagine the bolts themselves are riding along the top of this profile here with quite a bit of weight behind them. And that's why you can see it's chewed out the metal quite nastily in a few spots along there. Some of it's actually hidden behind this in the position that it's in now. But I mean, that was looking like that after the very first time that we adjusted between GT and Formula style. And, you know, we were being very, very careful to try and minimize the damage, you know, and in doing that, we still did end up with some marks there. Now, look, I mean, we don't have any scratches up and down this part here, other than just some of the coating having worn off where the markings are for the individual lines. It's likewise up here as well. This all slides pretty nicely. And again, look, it's about as good as it could be when trying to achieve this kind of result. So yeah, it's really difficult because, you know, I know a lot of people are going to be looking at this product and thinking, oh, fantastic, it's something that I can quickly change between Formula and GT. It's going to, you know, unlock all of this potential for me. And unfortunately, that isn't really the case because of the amount of effort that is actually in the real world required to switch between the two different styles of seating positions. But in saying that, it's not a reason to give the product a negative review either, because I can't personally think of a better way to do this. I mean, the ultimate thing would be, of course, to have a button that you could press with a couple of different presets, like an adjustable table, and have everything adjust for you. But I mean, that's not practical. That's going to be a lot more expensive and a lot heavier as well. But I mean, maybe they could do something like have some sort of a mechanical mechanism in the top of the profile here, so you could wind this up and down maybe. You know, there are a lot of things that you could do to make it better, but that would all add a lot of complexity and a lot of additional cost, of course, as well. So where I land on it is I think it does a very good job of, you know, either Formula or GT style seating positions, but adaptability between the two, although it's about as good as it could be, again, you just need to be aware that it isn't something you're going to be doing easily every single time. So I want to make that absolutely abundantly clear. Now, just on the subject of the Formula style seating position as well, didn't have any issues at all ergonomically with the GT or hybrid style. With the Formula style, I did run into a couple of difficulties here. Now, I'm 6 foot tall and a little bit disproportionate in that my legs are quite long compared to my torso and body. So I'm probably not the best usage case here, but I suppose 6 foot tall isn't absolutely massive either. But for me, with these particular pedals, I wasn't really able to get them in the ideal position for me. Now, with a Formula style seating position, or any style seating position for that matter, you always want to be braking from your thigh predominantly. So you don't want to be using your ankle for the braking. And I did really struggle with these very stiff pedals, which we used intentionally to test the flex. But you can see with the position that we ended up here, I do have my leg a lot more bent than I would like it to be. Ideally, I would want to have the pedal about there. Now you might be wondering, why don't we just adjust the pedals further back or move the seat back so my legs are straighter? But with what we were talking about before, with everything kind of being interlinked and what you do with one part influencing everything else, we can kind of run through the scenario here now. So if I move the seat further back, then the wheelbase becomes too far away from me. So I end up driving like this with my elbows out straight, which is of course not good. But if I hop up again, you can imagine if I move the seat back and then move the wheel deck back to match the seating position, because this is all interlinked, the pedals are going to move back with me as well. So that ends up in the same, with the same problem, just sitting further back on the base plate. Now you could say, well, you've still got another inch or so here to move this part back further towards the TV, but then we're bumping into these shoulder bolts up here, so we can't physically move this any further. So the only thing we could do there then would be to remove this, move it further back on here, and then have the bolt sitting underneath this part, but then makes it really awkward to adjust here. And even maxing out the available travel on the pedals here with these particular pedals and the position that the uprights of these pedals sit on this particular pedal tray, I just wasn't able to get it into a comfortable position. Now, if I had another pedal set on here that had the pedals further back in relation to where they mount to the fixing points, it wouldn't be a problem. But conversely, if they were the other way around and they were even further this way, it would be even more of a problem. So at 6 foot tall, I do feel like I'm pretty close to maxing out the available scope of adjustment for formula style seating position. But as I said before, I think the majority of people that buy this rig are probably going to end up with some sort of a hybrid seating position that they never really end up adjusting it from anyway. And I think that the amount of adjustment available here does mean that you're going to be able to get it into a very comfortable position regardless of that. So I don't think that that's necessarily a reason to be overly concerned. I think, most likely most people aren't going to be going into this extreme of a formula style seating position anyway. So in summary, I think they've done a really good job with this cockpit overall. There's a lot of attention to detail just with little things like the coating that they've used on the profile, which is nice and smooth. Just little inclusions like the felt pads that allow various different parts of the rig to slide more freely back and forth. And yeah, regardless of what we threw at it, a 25 Newton meter peak wheelbase here in the DD2 and the notoriously stiff Acertec Forte pedals. Yeah, absolutely no issues at all with perceivable flex while I was driving, and you guys can see in the driving footage for yourselves if there is any flex there, what that looks like, so you can make your own judgment with regards to that. But I can tell you from the driver's perspective, certainly no issues there whatsoever. The build process, putting everything together, was about as simple as it could possibly be for an aluminium profile cockpit. They've done a really good job with the documentation. They've got an installation video as well, if that's more your style. We've got written text in the guide as well as pictures, so regardless of whether you're a visual or a text-based learner, that is all covered as well. And I'm honestly yet to see an example of somebody who's had a bad customer experience with Next Level Racing. Although if you have, please do comment down below to let the people watching this video know what happened. But yeah, my experiences personally and all the experiences that I've seen generally online have been very positive with Next Level Racing. So no reasons really to be concerned there either. So yeah, I guess overall, I have no reason not to recommend this as a good option. I think really ultimately what it comes down to is the fact that, it's going to vary in cost depending on, what kind of shipping and taxes you have in your local area. Most of the cockpits at around this kind of price point are going to be pretty equally matched when it comes to things like flex anyway. So definitely check out some of the other reviews that we've done, as well as, of course, other people's reviews of options that might be available in your particular area. Depending on where you are in the world, can make a huge difference in what it's going to actually cost to get one of these cockpits to your door. And there may well be better options for you over this, depending on where you are in the world. So it's really just going to come down to that. But for what this is, I think it does a really good job. It would be amazing if they had an easier way to adjust between those seating positions, but I just can't really see a way that they could make it easier than it already is. And again, they haven't made out in their marketing, at least as far as I've seen, that it is something that's easy to change between seating positions. I mean, it probably is the easiest to achieve that out of the cockpits that we've tested, but it's not something that you're going to be doing every single time you want to change between cars. And I just want to make that absolutely clear for you guys. Just the other thing to be aware of as well, as we mentioned earlier, is that having these on an angle, although it does make it a lot easier to get in and out of the rig, does mean that as you move the wheelbase down, it will move further away from you. So that may be a problem for some people. It also just does make it a little bit more challenging to mount some accessories like button boxes, for example, as opposed to a vertical upright. So just keep that in mind as well. We talked about the T-nuts and the fact that they don't include any T-nuts that you can just slot in from the side. You do have to go in from the ends. That's not a problem with the way they've designed these channels. You don't have to take the end plates off, but if you are wanting to mount something in between two things that are already bolted in, that can be a little bit challenging compared to some other cockpits too. But all in all, I would have to say a good positive experience all the way from unboxing unboxing right through to driving and everything in between. So thumbs up from me. So if you do decide you want to pick one of these up, we do have some links available down in the description, which are an awesome way of helping support our work here at Boosted Media at no additional cost to you. So that's just a way that you guys can help support our work here if you find what we do beneficial. Definitely do check out some of our reviews of other cockpits too. Just do keep in mind that some of those reviews are getting a little bit old now, and there have been a few different revisions of some of those cockpits since we actually reviewed them. So just make sure you're doing your own research there. Have a look at some other people's reviews as well. That's always a good idea anyway, just to make sure that you're getting as much information as possible before you fork out a lot of money for something like this. But yeah, hope today's video has helped you out. If it has, please do leave a thumbs up. Consider subscribing to the channel as well if you haven't already. It always surprises me how many people watch these videos but aren't actually subscribed to the channel. I know it doesn't make a lot of difference in terms of what you see in your news feed or your YouTube feed these days, but it does make a big difference in telling YouTube that the videos are helpful and sending them out to more people so they can be informed and make better decisions on what they want to buy for their rigs. So thank you very much for watching, guys, and we'll leave it at that. I'll see you again very soon. Bye.